there are a series of characters of people who are not excessively well known. Some do. I guess obviously in NN, in this room where we are, people do know it. But if we go out on the street, probably nobody has heard of, or very few people have heard of any of these people that we are going to talk about now, and I quote them. And I bring up their cases because they are gender ideologues, and to contrast with the doctrines, with the philosophies that seem so effectively crazy, because we are going to follow their biography to realize who these people are. For example, in Spain there is an important gender ideologue, which is Maria Valcárcel, who held positions in the Asturian autonomous community related to education in the mid-90s, and is an older woman who also did her thesis on Nietzsche. And what about the right to evil? Women must renounce sweetness and must claim their right to evil. Your whole evolution and your whole philosophical development revolves around this idea, doesn't it? Of course, so it is not rare for these people, because gender ideologues have what they call, as I said before, the rejection of sweetness that ends up leading to what Bataille said about eroticism, which far from being an expression of love, it was an expression of pure hatred, not well. If we talk about sexual liberation, we have to start quoting Wilken Reis, for example. No Virgin Reis has a well-known book, which is The Mass Psychology of Fascism, where he deals, from the point of view of post-Freudian psychology, the rise of Nazism in the terms in which we are more or less talking now, not the expressions of fascism and more specifically of Nazism, because we would have to add the racial component there. These expressions would be expressions incubated within the family, and Virgen Rein insists again and again on this. In his time, he acquired, in short, a great reputation for psychosexual reasons, and also for the analysis he made of National Socialism. An analysis, in my opinion, absolutely, in short, wrong, although they may have some points of truth, because normally lies, the more we are more willing to believe, are those that contain elements of truth. Sure, well, Virgin Reich was a man who began being very, very, very young, committing acts of bestialism and zoophilia. He was a compulsive masturbator from a very young age. He attracted extraordinary attention in his family because at just 6-7 years old, he was compulsively dedicated to this type of thing. When truly, in short, at those ages, well, in short, the person is not made well. He already had a strong self-masturbating component, it's worth the expression, right? Developed a particular hatred of family as a projection of an anguish he felt for his own. Her mother had committed suicide because of the revelation that she had had a relationship with a 13-year-old boy. The mother and father had found out because the Virgin Ride himself, being small, had told the father of such that the mother. There's always a psychological drama behind all these stories. Wasn't he truly born? And there is an insurmountable trauma that, in a transfer of guilt from his father, coagulated into an anti-patriarchal ardor. No. And all his work would be an anti-patriarchal work. Logically, everything that has to do with that idea, with the idea of what the idea of justice is, what we have always understood by the ideas of justice, the idea of the homeland, all those kinds of things. Of course, God, or to speak clearly, were the object of his fury and his truly terrible hatred, right? He was expelled from the German Communist Party, to which he had belonged since 1930. He went to live in the United States, where in the 1950s he perpetrated one massive fraud in his clinics and ended up in prison. And massive fraud because this man may be a little crazy, but quite crazy, but he was not an idiot, and he used his clinics to, through so-called sexual therapies, subject women to all kinds of abuse, until the women realized that that was nothing more than a story on the way to have access. Easy for women, since they were the ones who went there with psychological problems, because otherwise it was not understood that they would go to this type of clinics, right? Wilhelm Reich is one of the essential pieces in the philosophical composition of the ideology of. Another major player in this affair was Alfred Kinsey. Alfred Kinsey is systematically cited by all progressives as something, shall we say, as the word of God on this subject. It is not another person who committed an absolute fraud, a brutal fraud in statistics. What did the sexual statistics do to demonstrate that the vast majority of the population really suffers from an unstoppable perversion, right? And developed his surveys among the prison population. What El Universo did not say when preparing the survey was the prison population. Sure, logically, the prison population, let's say, fortunately, is not one. It is not a population representative of society as a whole, but normally culturally and psychologically, since it corresponds to the margins of society. Well, he without saying which universe he had used for his. For his statistics, he uses this population. Naturally, he gave that 30 or so percent of the population is homosexual, 25 pedophiles, I don't know what, 111. Absolute madness. Well, despite that, the dominant thinking in this area of progressivism continues over and over again, quoting Alfred Kinsey as if nothing had happened. He was publicly shown the falsity of what he was writing, but obviously one truth is not going to spoil a headline, right? Well, Keynes and his wife built a sexual utopia at Indiana University in which, along with numerous progressive professors, they unleashed all sorts of perversions, some that I'm not, of course, going to describe, for they are extremely unpleasant even in our time, even knowing that there is no one here surely particularly innocent of child age. Still, would we shake us off? Probably not. But anyway, all kinds of perversions, extreme practices of sadomasochism with serious damage for the genitals, etc. Well, in a short time, homosexuality spread to the entire circle around kimchi, and later, well, in search of sufficiently stimulating novelties, they led to active pedophilia, right? Kimchi used methods, as I say, blatantly fraudulent, because what he wanted was to demonstrate that society was actually perverted and that what had happened was it was that a kind of superstructure had been imposed on itself so that people could not be free and therefore happy. Let us also not forget something that must be pointed out by way of parenthesis, and that is the treatment that was given to homosexuality at that time. Homosexuality was considered a serious deviation, and for example, the entire Soviet psychiatry was signed. But not only the Soviet one, the progressive one from Western Europe, also that there was an identity between homosexuality and fascism. The two things were the expression of hatred for the different, the expression of hatred, the one who disagreed, the one who was different from the majority, and therefore Corky came to write "kill homosexuals and you will kill fascism, EH." Therefore, fascism and homosexuality were very serious deviations, which could be ended with psychological treatment. Then comes the Frankfurt School and the Frankfurt School. What it does is reverse the terms, and what it says is not what it is. Homosexuality is not pathological. What is pathological is patriarchal values. Therefore, homosexuality is not as it was believed. Even Sartre himself wrote about that identity and fascism and homosexuality, but quite the opposite. But it took them 30 or 40 years to come to the conclusion that, as I say, of the Frankfurt School, to come to the opposite conclusion, to come to the conclusion that homosexuality was what was acceptable, and that really the heteropatriarchal thing that was said to have been said since then, and that today, as we see, has become fashionable. Heteropatriarchal is what? Truly perverse, not well of those after the Second World War, we can highlight a few, and gender biologists who form the basis of what, because these are like the holy patrons of this whole history, no? But those who really today are quoted with, let's say, many times without citing them personally, but their phrases and their ideas, since one of the first is Josh Batel, who was French, an admirer of the Marquis de Sade, who studied for Cura. He was Catholic by origin and wanted to become a priest. However, he ended up concluding that his churches were the brothels of Paris. No, this was the first step. He literally wrote about this. No, Bataille went much further. He ended up being a supporter of orgiastic Satanism. He propagated the virtues of ritual human sacrifices. He wrote about it. He founded a secret society, Headless Acephalus it was called, that was destined to carry out this kind of acts of and of beheadings. We're going from beheadings. Curiously, there was no shortage of people. He asked for volunteers to carry out this type of ritual, orgiastic satanic sex. And interestingly, there was no shortage of volunteers who offered to be sacrificed. What was missing was people willing to make the sacrifice, because it took you to jail, of course. But there is no shortage of people who offered themselves. This is truly amazing, this story. Bataille is the theorist of narcissistic eroticism, based on the consideration that the sovereign man is a potential murderer. Therefore, sexual sadism is the purest consequence of sexuality. For radical feminism and gender theorists, Bataille represents the insertion of the forgotten theme of pleasure into the class struggle. Through Bataille, Gender ideology considers that pleasure is actually equivalent to transgression. As you can imagine, all kinds of opinions have been poured out on Bataille's mental state, right? And well, at the time, a great controversy in France, because he was also a guy, well, absolutely bizarre, not in his daily teacher, one of the most reputable authors among all gender ideologues, perhaps the one who admired Bataille the most of all, by the way, although he far surpassed him, was Michel Foucault, who also claimed a spiritual affiliation with the Marquis de Sade and with Nietzsche. Unlike in other cases, his doctoral thesis deals with Nietzsche, was an obsessive homosexual and therefore created all his work that extraordinarily dependent on his biography. His biography can be followed and reconstructed through his work in an unmistakable way. Not Foucault, also a militant of the Communist Party for a few years. The stage that he considered as that of philosophical knowledge and generation of his own philosophy was initiated in the United States in homosexual sadomasochism and in the massive consumption of drugs of all kinds. No, it's him today. Him. Intellectual reference for homosexuals, bisexuals, transgenders, in short, lesbians, etc. Isn't Michel Foucault probably the most considerate of all gender ideologues, who is surely the one who has the most reputation and the one who has reached the highest, let's say in his philosophical conceptions, perhaps the most serious of all, right? Well, about his mental state. And I'm telling you, this guy is the most serious. Suffice it to say that in his younger years he carried out several suicide attempts, that there are testimonies that he chased his university classmates with a dagger in his hand, and that he conceived such an intense hatred for his body that on several occasions he bought razor blades to tear off his skin to skin himself. On one occasion a rope was found in his room because it was prepared for hanging, that is, for suicide. He was not a person who on several occasions tried to commit suicide and certainly harmed himself extremely. He did not die of AIDS in 1984 after having suffered a very serious traffic accident because of his drug addiction. Was he also a compulsive consumer of all types of drugs, right? Well, we have said that there is no single creator of gender ideology, that there are many who, but we can go through the common ideas and some institutions. For example, the case of Mark Garrett Sanger, not the creator of Planet Panicu, the great abortion multinational with sad current events due to everything that has happened in the United States with the sale of organs from aborted children, is well known. And this woman, well, who was a real nymphomaniac, ended up abandoning her family. He had several children and ended up leaving them in the house where he had a lot of money. She was a multimillionaire. His children lived in absolute destitution because he spent all day, well, anyway, having sexual relations, not in an irrepressible way. Schengen identified the rupture of traditional morality with a passionate defense of eugenics EH, a woman who also originally had some positive words towards Nazism, also because she was a militant anti-black racist, and in fact conceived her work of Planet Parenthood to a large extent, and thus applied to the abortion of the black population. In fact, today in the United States, the black population is by far the one who perpetrates the highest number of abortions, right? Well, obviously for economic reasons, right? Well, this lady, as we say, ended her days in an alcoholic delirium, and they had to admit her to a clinic. She had married a millionaire and then had relationships with several of them, which supported her very well, and which was in fact the origin of the fortune that has given rise to the Planet multinational Forcat, which is also important to say. It is also one of the main funding sources of Democratic candidates for the White House, for the presidency of the United States. It has been with Obama, and it has been very visible, let's say very graphic, with Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton, in addition, has come out defending. It has appeared on several occasions, but above all, it is one of the fundamental sources of income for that candidacy. Hillary Clinton is the woman who has dedicated herself in recent years to imposing gender violence around the world and abortion programs, conditioning development aid in Latin America on the acceptance by states of reproductive health policies, a euphemism for abortion. And logically, that is driven by Flanet also selling ideas and theories that are not only patently false, but also the founders themselves. From Planet Parenthood, they have recognized. I'll just make a quote saying that one major in the 70s openly acknowledged in public that the distribution of condoms, it would not reduce the number of abortions. If not, on the contrary, it would multiply them, because the first effect that condoms have is the multiplication of sexual relations outside the established channels, let's say. Consequently, this multiplication of sexual relations leads to a greater number of pregnancies. There are absolutely serious studies in the United States that show that the states in the United States in which sex education is provided are states in which there is a much higher number of abortions than the states in which there is no such compulsory sex education. Good. In parentheses, I have said, well, bisexual was Margaret Mead, a woman who also contributed very powerfully to the dissemination of these ideas, an anthropologist who created one of the longest running frauds. Also in history, the fraud from idyllic Samoa went to Samoa in the 1920s. Samoa was there, but it was where it is, obviously, but then it was farther away because it was much harder to get to Samoa, wasn't it? And then it was invented that in Samoa society was very free, that far from the clutches of Christianity, because people there lived without any type of barriers, their sexuality absolutely free, etc. No, years later the truth was discovered, not the blushing discovery of the mystification that Margaret 1000 had carried out. Because Samana was actually a notoriously repressive society, and yet it is another case like Kinski's where it is systematically cited as a kind of source of all anthropological wisdom. Well, one of the main feminists who has also been particularly concerned with this issue of gender ideology has been Shulamith Firestone, who made the suppression of the family his real obsession, his priority goal. For Shulamith Firestone, motherhood, she says, represents the radical oppression suffered by women, the reproductive servitude determined by biology. That phrase sums it up perfectly. What is your vision, don't you? Reproductive bondage determined by biology. Then you have to oppose biology, you have to deny biology. She is the author of a famous book that sold very well in the 60s, The Dynamics of Sex, and in 1970 she was. Yes, she was determined to have a bad head and was admitted to a psychiatric clinic. He's still in a mental hospital today. The good woman is not dead. Another of the greats of our time, already very close to the 80s and 90s, was 4 or 5 years ago here in Madrid. It's Kate Miller, a fervent Maoist militant who married a Japanese man and who became a lesbian because a large proportion of lesbians are not lesbians because they are attracted to women. But they are lesbians for ideological reasons, because they despise man to such an extent that they consider that man is not even good for sexuality. So they don't really have an attraction to women, they have an attraction to men, but they can't afford to have sex with men. In the latest trend in militant lesbianism is that it is very caring, right? This is not a joke in the disposition when it comes to having sexual relations in bed. Neither should be on top of the other, because that is an act of domination, and therefore relationships must be kept in parallel. Well, Kate Miller was the creator of lesbianism as a political compromise. In short, to the genuinely feminist concept that the private is also political. In other words, there are few expressions more complete than what totalitarianism is. No, the private is also political. Time has not diminished the reality of his LA, the radicality of his postulates, no. Well, this woman is also suffering from severe mental deterioration. She has also been admitted to a psychiatric institution, and she herself has asked to be monitored 24 hours a day, because she wants to commit suicide and because she has a tendency to commit suicide. But no, he doesn't want to die for one or the other. He doesn't want to commit suicide, but he doesn't want to die, which is certainly complicated, don't you? In the progressive world of North American universities, no one gave him a job at the time because, anyway, his mental state prevented it, and that has only aggravated, of course, his condition. One of Kate Millet's friends was Elizabeth Fisher, a classic radical bohemian from the Greenwich Village, not the hippie plan. Not of all these things that Afra founded, the first feminist literary newspaper probably in the world, but certainly in the United States, which ended up committing suicide. As also did her close friend Maria del Bravo, of Cuban origin, if I remember correctly, and also her other friend, the group of 4 Ellen Frankfurt, who committed suicide in 87 when she turned 50, determined that she had already lived too much and committed suicide. That is, the 401 age group is in a psychiatric hospital, and 3 didn't have time because they committed suicide well. Among the most important of the late 20th century is German Greer. This is perhaps among feminists after Kate Miller. She is perhaps also the most cited. He is a clear exponent of the living radical contradiction. He is the author of a book called The Eunuch Woman, who had one that had a large circulation, because in the book it raises a question as substantive as the differences and as the struggle that women establish based on the types of orgasm. No, and there would be a struggle of women between women of vaginal orgasm and of clitoral or clitoral orgasm, which in both ways I think can be said well. Grill has taken a turn in recent years. She has ended up abhorring that of feminism, and even now she is in favor of chastity and even the family, although she says that families logically must be accepted in their full extent because, in fact, she has already married a transsexual. Well, in the end, this woman, who had some intellectual seriousness in origin, has finished the British edition of Big Brother. I mean, that's why I think it's an appropriate ending. In any case, no. Well, for finishing, who promotes all this madness? Not the left intellectuals, the progressive intellectuals in intellectual terms, not progressivism in intellectual terms. Nowadays, a big part of that good is that saying intellectual and right wing is a symbol. But anyway, I mean, some intellectuals who are not leftists, have assumed it with absolute enthusiasm. And leaving that aside, which we have more or less already seen, a series of international organizations, public organizations such as the United Nations, or national organizations such as the United States. And a very important thing that is often not mentioned because it is not interesting, because we are in the era in which it seems that everything public is bad and everything private is good, almost by definition, by nature. Because it must be said that it is driven very powerfully by private foundations, by billionaire foundations, by the foundations of Rockefeller, Bill Gates, Ted Turner, of the great American billionaires. All of them promote population control through abortion, homosexuality, hypersexuality, feminism, environmentalism, euthanasia. All of these are factors, let's say, auxiliary of gender ideology, North American foreign policy. Always at the service of the plutocracy of power, of the money that our days impose. As we said, the adoption of this type of policy to be able to receive external aid is development aid, right? As I say, especially in Latin America, millionaires who are at the head of the best endowed economic foundations in the world are the drivers. The objective is population control, in which the large fortunes are involved, who estimate that for their interests the amount of population existing on the planet is excessive. And logically, where we have to remove population is to start from the third world, but also from the first, and fill the population of the first world with population from the third. Is this one of the explanations that the same people who are promoting these are the same gentlemen who are promoting the population displacement movements that we are witnessing in recent times, right? It promotes contraception and abortion throughout the world by introducing the former to demand the latter. As we had said before, it was not John Rockefeller III who understood in the 1960s, thanks to Joan Dunlop, that population control policies in a hyper-individualist West should be based on the so-called expansion of women's rights. The international campaign for family planning was not working, a failure in the 60s and 70s, and therefore it was when we began to talk about that phrase that we have heard so much, especially during the time of Jose Luis. Shoemaker, and what has remained to this day of the expansion of rights, in this case of women's rights, that sells well, right? The Rockefeller Foundation has an influence on numerous governments in a very direct way, as a North American Nagorian, obviously. And the Rockefeller Foundation is the nucleus, not only, but the fundamental one, the Bilderberg Club, and has a very powerful indirect influence on the totality of Western governments, counting, of course, ours, if ours is a government and is a good Western one. Another of the tycoons at the head of our programs is Turner, not the creator of CNN, who has set up the United Nations Foundation, to which he endowed only with an initial contribution of $1 billion, which is a third of his original fortune, according to the estimate of Forbes magazine. By the way, he has turned the UN into an organization servile to his designs, right? Well, since the 90s, he's been promoting global birth control plans. He is one of the major funders of Planned Parenthood, of the American Federation of Planned Parenthood. He is also behind Catholics for Afri Choice Group. Anyway, Global Fund for Women, the Alan Goodmash Institute, and Greenpeace is one of those behind Greenpeace. Planned Parenthood awarded him in 2004. Man is the one who pays the Margaret Sanger Prize, which recognizes her efforts in favor of abortion around the world. They focus primarily on the promotion of abortion among the lower classes. Billionaire George Soros, who has also donated $100 million to Human Rights Watch to promote abortion and for abortion to be considered a human right. Anyway, so I would not compete with anyone else but the pregnant woman, and not the man or the state, only the woman. Well, George Soros, as we know, has been publicly accused by Viktor Orban of being the promoter of the immigration of displaced people from the Middle East to Europe, and George Soros has publicly acknowledged it. Therefore, it is not any type of conspiracy or anything like that. Anyway, Part of this program involves the promotion of the most radical environmentalism and an animalistic ideology that relativizes the human being based on the lifespan of the planet. Although they present it as a feeling full of sensitivity, it hides less and less that it is a fierce humanophobia that conceives of the human being as an element subordinate to the needs of the earth. De Turner, the creator of CNN, has called on governments to adopt the Chinese model of mandatory one child, although now the Chinese have revised it because they realize that in the year 2045-2050, it will be unsustainable the Chinese economy to continue with this policy, claiming that it is the only measure capable of saving the environment. By the way, does China justify the mandatory abortion policy in which there are fewer CO2 emissions? That is, there is an obvious relationship between one thing and the other. Well, for one of the population control theorists, Paul Ehrlich, who was recently rewarded by the Generalitat of Catalonia with an award with the, I don't remember the name now, but let's go with an award that they award every year. There are several species, Catalan replica of the Nobel Prizes. The comparison is worth it. Well, certainly unlucky, but in short, Paul Ehrlich was rewarded with one of the main A prizes in the humanities. That's right, population growth for him is like a cancer. That you have to have Sahar Paul Ehrlich is already a very old person. He has been 50 years old, saying that the world is heading towards a population bomb, towards an explosion, and he predicted that by 1970 there would have been civil wars in the United States and Great Britain related to the increase in population. Even though his predictions seem to be not serious, he does not stop receiving awards. No, Paul Ehrlich says that we have to end that control, that population growth. It literally says that you have to make brutal and ruthless decisions. The pain can be intense. Well, those who say that the government should never interfere in matters as private as the number of children a couple decides to have may be in for a very unpleasant surprise in a very short time. Good. Biologist David Craver longs for man's swift punishment and hopes that viruses will rebuke human audacity to eat from the tree of the science of good and evil. Neither human happiness nor its fertility are as important as a natural planet. We are a plague to ourselves and to the earth. We must disappear. In that idea of the human being as a plague, he coincides with Greenpeace, which in its pamphlet Paradise Lost counts down to destruction. So called, it assures that man has multiplied his members to plague proportions, eliminating 500 species of animals like a bestial creature. I had the opportunity to speak to people from Greenpeace in a colloquium, and they came to recognize almost openly that we had to reduce it in any way. The human population, and that even given the choice between overpopulation and the elimination of the human species, we would have to opt for the elimination of the human species. Specifically, I told him, well, you talk about the human being as a plague. I would ask you what is done with plagues. No, well, you will be exterminated, and they did not deny it. They gave all kinds of circumlocutions to not recognize what was obvious, but in the end, with their small mouths, they ended up recognizing that, as I tell you, given to choose between one thing and the other, the extinction of the human being was desirable so that the planet could exist. I could move on. Not well. Birdman Keevan, Indiano Nature. The End of Nature quotes John Moore, who sums up the feeling he possesses thinking of man-eating crocodiles. It's not one, it's a phrase that he coined and that he usually quotes with. Professionally, you mean the saurians, eh? And the relationship with human beings, he says, are honorable representatives of the great and ancient source that once populated the earth. I hope you all enjoy many centuries among the water lilies of your hunts. I bless you now and always with a good piece of human flesh, terrified in your mouth like a treat. Anyway, these are the subjects that we discuss. Gender ideology consists of various components, some standing alone. Gender ideology and the surrounding ideologies that enable it. We are amidst a revolution in progress, a revolution aiming to reverse the path of 2,000 years, a revolution that Chesterton foresaw almost a century ago when he predicted its imminent proclamation. Chesterton called for a novel religion that, while exalting lust, prohibited fecundity. And this is a phrase from Chester from the 1920s, almost 100 years ago he said this to finish. Finally, let us remember a reflection by Nietzsche about the role that his philosophy would one day play in the world. Doesn't it say, will ever go, join my name to the memory of something gigantic, of a crisis such as there has never been on earth, to the memory of the deepest collision of consciousness of a decision taken by means of a spell against everything that had hitherto been believed? against everything that until that moment had been demanded, against everything that had been sanctified in the midst of that cosmic crisis that shakes the consciences of humanity. And that shows us that nothing is good, nor bad, nor beautiful, nor ugly, nor right, nor wrong, neither truth nor lie, in the midst of that truly gigantic crisis. We are today, in all probability, although it is true that always with necessary prudence, but in all probability we can affirm that the history of man had never reached such a point of degradation. That we are facing the last revolution, no longer that of man against God, but against nature, and not against nature in the abstract or against an alien nature, but against his own. Well, thank you very much.
Well, I'll tell you first, I wanted to congratulate you on this revealing and insightful presentation. This conference has enlightened me about aspects that I was unaware of. I wanted to ask you, what is the state of the issue in Israel? That is to say, in Israel, these types of policies are promoted, allowed, implemented, because I have some information to the contrary, and then evidently I think it is very pertinent to combine these types of policies with a view to eliminating the invigorating element of Western society, which is somewhat the one that has perpetrated policies the most. Thanks to creating a homogeneous society, and it is it that must be weakened based on bringing elements from other parts. Therefore, it is where gender politics is most effective. It is in the West. And so if you are homosexual, you will see more in certain, for example, on television, in fashion, in cinema. And if you're not, you probably won't succeed in Israel, where immigration is banned. If you are not Jewish, that is, they don't bring anyone from Syria on a boat. They occupy an area of Israel, but an area of Syria, but they don't admit refugees. The issue of the gender of homosexuality, etc. How are you doing? You know that? Can you illustrate something for us? Something in Israel? I see. It is. He's obviously first. Israeli society is one of the societies with the largest number of people who confess to being materialistic. In other words, it is a society where the Jewish profession of faith, the Orthodox Jew in at this time, is not well regarded at all for obvious reasons, because the state of Israel is the culmination of a Zionist process, and a process therefore that has deified the state. The Orthodox Jew feels very displeased with that. They are exempt from paying taxes, which in turn generates enormous controversy in the country and a certain animosity against them naturally. Well, and all these types of things have a very strong response in Israeli society has gone less. They are at a stage much earlier than ours, so to speak. That is, they have taken care of certain things. Why, for example? There have been cases of recognition of homosexuality, of recognition of transsexuality. Not long ago, an Israeli transsexual singer, appeared publicly. Now Israel is a country. On a war footing. Yes, it is a country on a war footing, and it is a country that knows that its survival depends on being pushed by the sea. It is a country in which the 6,000 or so inhabitants, at least those who are of military age, are in almost permanent mobilization. And as far as I know, the thing is, this is from a few years ago. I couldn't say exactly right now, but as far as I know, there's no recognition. Well, there's an Israeli society, let's say the one that's in Tel Aviv, the one that's in Haifa, the one that's in, let's say, the developed areas, the one that's in the secularized society, that works one way and the other society works another way. It is not the same Jerusalem as Tel Aviv, but if it is true, I have been to Tel Aviv, and if it is true that you can see it. The street, openly homosexual elements, that is, in that sense, whether you like it or not, has permeated, because in the end, Jewish culture, Israeli Jewish culture, is very secularized, and in a certain way they also suffer the attacks that we are suffering as much as here, not as much as in the United States, not as much, above all, as in Spain. No, Spain is the first country in the world, and this is the first. In fact, the community of Madrid has just raised the issue of surrogacy, which, for example, the European Union had advised against. Well, we have gone further. We have pulled the European Union by the ears.
for not being progressive enough. In other words, what is happening in Spain has no comparison, but as far as I know, as far as Israel is concerned, in the most secularized part of society, elements of that type are publicly seen. I mean, I've seen them.
Thanks from Israel. There are 222 facts that are transcendental, what you have said about materialism and orthodox. Second, Israel has one of the largest anti-militarist peace movements in the world, and the gay community in Tel Aviv, so much larger than that of, relatively larger in terms of population than that of San Francisco.
It has many, many local worlds.
And it is known that that community has the same power as that of the homosexual in this. Then evil has come to them. Whoever designed that evil has reached them. Secondly, I wanted to ask you what in the face of this revolution that is man's, first it is against God and now against nature and against man, on what foundations, on what principles should we fight? Stop to fight it for men.
I think we're going to see, my vision is not very positive, to be honest. That is to say, I believe that we are in a very accelerated process of decline. I think Western civilization is in its last stage. I believe that the political, philosophical, and economic forms it has adopted are those of a deeply decadent society, and therefore I believe that today there is a generalized moral rearmament which necessarily has to count on the elements of which it has constituted in Europe, because we cannot think of a strictly national resurrection, but it has to be national. Yes, patriotic, of course, but with those who are also nationals and patriots in Europe, because otherwise it is impossible, and those common elements must be reactivated within those common elements. From my point of view, of course, the Slavic world also counts without the slightest doubt. Without going into the question of Russia, which I know usually raises controversies in our circles, with these circles, the truth is that the world with the world is a lake. We must certainly count, the backbone elements, and I believe that it is no nonsense, because in fact where you are seeing a response are the elements that are constituting the response, precisely the nuclear elements of that response, since I understand that it is basically our tradition. It is rich and varied, that it is a plural tradition in the best sense of the word, because it is, and that it should be sufficient, let's say, the elements that we have, the common elements to articulate it. For example, logically, our Greco-Roman heritage, our Christian heritage, these seem to me to be the basic pillars. Anything that is not, that is giving into this, to this which is essentially anti-Christian. In my opinion, what is happening is, that's why I talk about the last revolution, the last battle. What's happening is a challenge to the crystallization of the world that took place in the 4th century, and that's why I think it's the most important event that's happened since then, right? I understand that we have to revitalize the elements, and I believe that that is where all future political action is going, the elements of identity. But I believe that anything other than claiming that, anything other than revitalizing the elements of our own identity, it's not going to get us anywhere. Of course, I also think that there are some elements that many people probably don't like, or we don't like, but that we have to assume, because they are elements of our time. And if you want to have political effectiveness, and if you want to have ideological effectiveness, you have to give in. That is, we have to copy the enemy a little bit. We have to copy Lenin. We have to take steps forward and one back. And there are times we have to take that step back. We sometimes admit things that we don't like at all, but we have to play with the elements we have. I think that, in my opinion, that's where things are going, and the response that is being given in Europe is very variable, right? That is very varied. There are people who are responding from the perspective of what it can be, the approaches that can be identified. For example, with Perina, we are going to put, on the one hand, there are people who are in his proposal, because it is the one that President Putin can represent. There are people who do it from other points of view, such as Orban, or what is suffering in Poland. There are people who are defending it from a virtuality, say, of the French National Front. There are many answers. There are answers that, if they are based on identity, they can be. I think they will be positive. And we have the case that, in the end, has demonstrated what the ultimate nature of what is everyone. For example, that me. which I think is a huge disappointment, which has been good. What a huge disappointment. If anyone expected anything, I admit that I did expect something, and in the end I did not. Well, no, nothing has come of it, which is the case of Greece, not the case of Syriza. I considered that it could be an answer that I did not share 100%, of course, but a response to globalism, to globalization, and to what I have raised from Brussels. And what I have seen is that in the final analysis, no, it is not like that. And in the final analysis, in short, they have yielded to the mandates of Brussels, to the mandates of this globalism and globalization that they claim to be fighting, and in the end they have adopted a program, even economic, of cutting pensions. Anyway, I don't want to go into detail, but I want to say that in the end it is a question, in my opinion. Marine Le Pen said it perfectly. There is a dividing line that separates patriots and world champions. I think everything else we could almost say. I'm not saying about CDs anymore because they are things that logically make up the nature of each side, but I think the line goes there. Broadly speaking, find me.
I see. Let's see. I precisely asked the question because beyond economic crises, there is a phrase from Professor Alfonso Well. This is a problem in Spain. The problem is stupidity, and it is true because things that are accepted.
Incredible.
But I see that the only countries. Did you talk about the Slavs? It is that precisely they are a single point of criminal regeneration in Europe, and well, they are not because they preserve nationalism, identity, and Christianity because Putin has built more.
Churches, in which?
It has been built in Europe in a long time, and I see that the only three countries that truly respond to this globalism are Poland, which is Catholic, or Hungary, which is Catholic, but not Christian and Orthodox. And that's my question, a revival of Christianity? Not of the official, which in many cases is sold to that of Christianity and its foundations, would be, what do you call, a real moral in the face of this?
Yes, I am convinced that yes, and what I want to say is yes, but of course to qualify it is that this revitalization of Christianity would perhaps have to begin with the great institution of Christianity. Sure. Then yes, obviously yes, in my opinion, yes. In my opinion, Christianity is the backbone of the identity of European identity, without a doubt. Does it have other things, obviously, but other things that were Christianized? Because in the end, Christianity, has a lot of Platonism. It is undoubted, right? And a large part of Nietzsche's criticism, precisely of Christianity, was original Platonism, not that of Christianity. In my opinion, it certainly does go there. And in fact, as you have perfectly pointed out, the countries that show a certain revitalization are the countries that follow that Christian line. I'm going further. Even with some exceptions. That is why I do not know if this can be stated in an absolute way, but yes, at least in a relative way, it has turned out to be much worse for national cultures and identities. Capitalism than communism. Countries that have emerged from communism have gone out in search of their own identity. And its national identity has been less devastated, it has been less destroyed and less eroded than the countries that have been suffering from capitalism since the Industrial Revolution, and whose national cultures and whose identities are much more undermined than communist countries. In the end, in some places at least, a version of the communism of national Kochevism appeared, and partly. Some governments in the East obey this phenomenon because Stalin obeys it. No, I am not a big supporter of Ceausescu's Romania, but without a doubt none of them tried at least 1/3 of the way of separation from Moscow, maintaining a socialist way, the same way as Yugoslavia. In another order of things and such, in the end, these countries maintain a greater sense of identity than is maintained in the West, and I think that is the irrefutable regime outside. It is true that in some other countries this is not the case. Perhaps the most classic, most striking case is Czechoslovakia. No, but perhaps with that exception of Czechoslovakia, it happens in the rest of the countries and Hastatal ES. So even the identity movements in a country that through the avatars of history, experience both regimes, the capitalist and the communist, such as Germany, it turns out that it is in the formerly communist area of Germany where that identity is vindicated with the greatest force. Well, maybe that should lead us to deep reflection, right? Yes.
Yes, I wanted to count on you with everything you said. Basically, what we have about cultural Marxism today is basically that it all comes from the Frankfurt School, which is before the First World War. And then, because he celebrated with the Frankfurt School, later with that name, the social engineering that the gutter does, however, in a sense, the ornament Eric Front with saying that
being born with a saxophone is a thing of the bourgeoisie or of the society in which you are born, and above all, Marcus. And all these people are all the people who have manufactured all this. What happens that everything comes, I don't know if you will agree with me at the base. What one of the experiments I did try was the middle of 68. So what do they base themselves on? In that what they had manufactured in Russia was because there were enormous social differences between the working class and the power that they wanted to derive. But in Europe, that no longer happened because the bourgeoisie and the working classes were no longer as low as the others. Then they have to invent something else. And what do they invent? Well, you have to invent yourself. All this comes together, gender ideology and all these types of arguments, the homosexual movement, the feminist movement, local separatism, where it matters. Why? Because in fact, the new workers, for them, what are immigrants? They are the new proletariat that they have to absorb. And basically, he channels all that, adding what you've said, the Bill Gates thing, Turner, though. I understand that, but I find it hard to believe that Testalder and Bill Gates are in the orbit of Jewish globalism when they are not, but they seem to buckle to it. And what's being manufactured now is part of what was designed in 1923, which is the Kalegi Plan. The Kalegi Plan is this, but let's see. We have to mix Europe or mix it completely to make it a tame breed. Why enough? Skillful enough to serve us, but wise enough to handle it. That is what the channel that designed and proposed in the I Am.
Basically, okay, yeah. There is a character who is the one that the Frankfurt School is the key. Certainly none is the key. Frankfurt School is the reason for all this. Habermas, Forchheimer's ornament philosophy. Walter Benjamin Marcuse's, of course. Of Erich Fromm, of course, this is clear, and he is also the one who has sold it best, because the Frankfurt School, man for having been its components of Jewish origin, persecuted by Hitler and so on, well, they have the march off. Excellence, let's not say. And it is true that from a philosophical point of view, they are very estimable characters or philosophers. That's true, isn't it? It is another thing that, in short, that what posed an absolute helplessness. But philosophical training is indisputable, isn't it? And his philosophical height, too.
Or what Podemos is partly that.
But it's not just that. I believe that there are many more things in Podemos. But hey, that's another topic, right? I believe that there is a central figure in all this to understand what happened, taking into account that the Frankfurt School is effectively around the issue around which the whole issue revolves. By the way, I have tried on some occasion to talk a little with an editor, write about the Frankfurt School and so on and so forth. And it's reason impossible, huh? I mean, no, this topic is a topic that you don't want to talk about. I mean, but good is the figure of Gramsci.
Of course, I know.
He first realizes that the world has changed, that the Marxism that Marx knew was a Marxism. Sorry, the capitalism that Marx knew was a capitalism, therefore with an almost stereotyped image, not of the Jew putting coins in a sock at night by the light of a lamp. No, and I say, damn, no. Anyway, Berstenkowska and such, they already change Marxism and say, no, this is not like that, Marx. He was wrong in that. What has occurred is not a movement, let's say, of the growth of the proletariat, which has fewer and fewer means of production or none, while those who have means of production are fewer and so on, but they have more means of production. No, not this. It has not happened that way, because popular capitalism, joint stock companies, middle classes, state protection have appeared, especially in Germany. So good, then they realize that it's not going that way. What is the ultimate nature of communism, of Marxism? Its ultimate nature. What is social justice? No, evidently there is not an article, if you will allow me, by José Antonio Primo de Rivera, which is called Bolshevism, as I was told at the time. It was not published in ABC on July 31st, I think I remember, in 1935. In that article, José Antonio gives the keys to what it really is. It is communism, it is Marxism. He says Bolshevism will be able to renounce everything. It will be able to renounce collectivization. That doesn't matter. That doesn't matter to them. What it will never be able to renounce, everything it proposes politically, what it will never renounce is the material conception of the world. That's the core of communism. That's the core of Marxism. What did Gramsci realize? Gramsci said, let's see, we want to create the new man, mutate the nature of man, and for that we are going to do it through a socialist revolution that is going to appropriate itself through the known basis, dictatorship of the proletariat, of means of production, socialism, and then communism. Let's change the man. That is the way. That is the way. That is the path by which what we are going to achieve, what we are going to accomplish, what we are going to obtain is an anthropological revolution, which is the goal of Marxism. But even so, he realizes that he doesn't say there is no need. He says there is no need to socialize the means of production. We will get to that. But the fundamental thing to change man, is not even to appropriate the means of production. He said, don't give me proletarian lessons. Give me teachers. Give me the teachers, give me the professors, give me the publicists, give me the people who create public opinion. I change the culture, I change the superstructure, which for Marxism is a superstructure, and great if you realize that it is not, that it is the other way around. And he says, if our goal is to change culture, if our goal is to change man, how does man change through culture? I don't need the financial part, it'll come. But can cultural Marxism be defended in a hyper-individualistic society, which is the opposite of the original communist collectivism? Sure. You just have to see it. That is, communism doesn't care about collectivization, and it doesn't care about social justice. It is nothing more than the means and lever to reach the end. Because there Marx says that he will take the Hegelian idea of dialectics, because there those injustices will jump society. What are we interested in? Let there be injustices, and the more the better. Man, the motto of any revolutionary is the more you pair, logically. And Marxism is, let's say, the first to realize that. That issue, the central figure for me is Gramsci, who realizes the role that this has within the class struggle within Marxism, and he says, not like that, not the other way around. You don't have to make a revolution to change culture and change man. You don't have to change the culture. That's how we change.
The man, and it's completed.
The revolution. Yalo. They have done.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the conference, and I wanted to ask you two questions. We have talked about the Slavic countries, and at the same time, we have talked about Marxism. Any relationship that can't be left behind? So I wanted to ask you, first of all, what is your opinion about the communist parties of those in the Slavic countries that in many cases oppose homosexuality immigration? These cases. And on the other hand, regarding the Frankfurt School, it seems to me that the figure of George Lucas has been slightly overlooked, the figure of George Lucas. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think George Lucas's influence would be on ideology? Okay.
To start from the beginning, obviously George Lucas has left me many important, very important people, and also, in short, I have about this a lot of things written, and I've had to cut out a lot because I say I don't know where to start, I don't know where to end. Let's try to do it in a way that is more understandable for people who maybe don't come without much idea, because it is normal for them to end up coming out at least with a generic idea of the matter. No, but he is right, man. He is a central figure, George Lucas, without any doubt. Without any doubt, he has a great influence. He is one of the main ideologues, and in fact, by his type of elaboration. And for his training and for his cultural and philosophical training, it is one of those that can be cited by gender ideologues and by the people who defend this, one of those that can be cited and cited, let's say, with greater solvency. In other words, he is one of the great figures. If I had to stay with three figures, probably. In philosophical terms, we would talk about, I say staying because of his influence, we would not talk about Virgin Ride, we would talk about Luke, and it would surely be difficult to choose between anyone. Well, maybe Foucault tells me because of the influence he has today. Okay, and then as for the communists in Eastern Europe, well, there are a lot of communist parties that are strongly patriotic. There are. Whether or not it is nonsense from the point of view of Marxism would be another question, but the truth is that they can play that role for a certain time. The Communist Party in Russia today is a party that effectively opposes because it understands more a means of domination. Look, there is one of the fundamental influences of Podemos. Unfortunately, I believe that for them and for us today in Podemos, it is a Slovak philosopher called Sisek. He's a very interesting guy. He is a guy who, from a radical left, considers that the revolution is the revolution and the struggles of sexual liberation do nothing more than distract from one side of the objective. And secondly, they are bourgeois struggles. They don't say, they are struggles as you call them. They are literally entertainment struggles between the bourgeoisie and the upper class, something very similar. For example, in terms of everything that is gender ideology, for example, it opposes mass emigration, as in the case of Spain. Professor Jorge Verstringe, for example, who is one of the ideologues of Podemos. What happens is that I think it has less influence than it seems, because otherwise things would go the other way, wouldn't they? And in Russia that happens, that they realize that indeed, along the lines of what we were discussing now, all that sort of thing is deeply pernicious to the process. Yes, yes.
Yes, the Russian Orthodox Church named the Monso Neighborhood Book as Man of the Year last year, 2015.
Well, and Stalin, when he had to reach out to the Orthodox Church because it was tight, he reached out. But I want to say that what we all know was credible. We know what there was, but from the perspective of the population, it was credible. No, Stalin, when the invasion of Germany occurred, not on June 22nd, 1941, apart from the fact that he was hidden there for 10 days when he finally came out, not on July 3rd and gave his radio address to the Russians. What Stalin appeals to is not Lenin nor to proletarian reduction or anything, but to the heroes of the Russian past, etc. No, undoubtedly the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was largely a patriotic party, without a doubt. And in fact, today, Russian patriotism, even if it is anti-communist, is a patriotism that assumes that past, because it represented Russia's moment of greatest splendor in history. It is a fact, and therefore it is not like here that it is about erasing 40 years and that nothing has happened here. No, and that, no, it is far from being on display. In fact, that already has a long tradition in a country like Russia, because Stalin himself claimed the time of Ivan the Terrible, because Ivan the Terrible had been the one who had put the Goyards on the streets, not the nobility. Levantiskata did not allow, therefore, that construction of a unitary monarchy that would lead a little later to a good state. Is that celebrated in Russia, let's say, as a stage towards the modernization of Russia, and therefore towards the growth and emergence, the suffering of Russian power in Russia? To sum it up very much, there have always been two souls, let's say, one very Slavophile and the other European, right? What can then be represented to Petersburg was Leningrad, which is a vocation much more towards Europe, etc., and Moscow's Russia. And there always has been. In fact, Stalinism permanently suspected everything that had to do with Leningrad. Not Leningrad was treated very badly by Stalin. Why? Because it was Russia. In fact, the Minguero St. Petersburg had been built by Peter the Great from scratch in the northern marshes, and such in imitation of what Paris was then, it was, well, in short, a European vocation, and is seen throughout in all Russian literature, especially the 19th century, not that tendency. And in the Bolshevik Revolution, there are two very strong tendencies. One strongly patriotic, which is that of Stalin, the Commissar for Nationalities. Anyway, there is to laugh about. And Trotsky, Jewish internationalist. He's the one of cosmopolitanism, and it is with which it ends, because it represents the man willing to sacrifice the revolution in Russia as long as the revolution spreads everywhere. I didn't prefer Berlin to be Bolshevik before it was Bolshevik. Moscow, obviously Stalin, not well in. That means that there is a real inheritance, because that proletarian internationalism ended up being an excuse in the hands of Stalin, and later ended up being an excuse for the expansion of purely, let's say, Soviet patriotism, to not say just Russian. But it is true that this is the case, and consequently there are a large part of, not all, but many communist parties in Eastern Europe who have a deep patriotic sense, and they also understand that all this accompanies globalism, that all gender ideology, that everything that has to do with those race. And it's true, it's part of the globalist movement. What's more, in my opinion, it is not that it is part of it, it is that it is the ideological core to end this, the last one, let's say the big one, the big problem that arose 3 years ago between Putin and the Westerners, when the Olympic events in Sochi, etc. It was because they pressured him to make laws recognizing homosexual marriage, and Putin flatly refused. European leaders did not attend that event, or Obama, for precisely that reason, because he refused that, and because he refused to allow Russian children to be adopted abroad by homosexual couples. And that was the key to the whole thing, to the whole discrepancy. Then to Putin but don't touch on an excessively sensitive subject. But he made up stories about Ukraine, etc. Because regardless of the sympathies that there may be for the issue of Ukraine, which I understand perfectly and such, the one who is behind Ukraine is alone. So, I mean, everything has everything. It has the same explanation. There is a globalist movement underway that wants to crush peoples, that wants to crush their identity. And gender ideology is undoubtedly a very powerful weapon.